Section 2, The Prairies. The Prairies. I believe that the place you live in as a child has a profound influence on you. Certainly the prairies of Canada shaped me. Manitoba, where I spent my childhood and early adulthood, still feels like home. Saskatchewan, where I spent my middle years, reinforced my love of the prairies. It also had a big impact on me politically. These two provinces, and the prairies in general, continue to be my reference point no matter where I live. Much as Carol and I love Ontario, we often refer somewhat wistfully to the big wide sky and open spaces of the prairies and the friendly people. During our time in Botswana, we kept comparing that landscape to the prairies. Although Manitoba shaped my childhood and early adulthood, living in Saskatchewan really expanded my understanding of the prairies. My first job after university was as a mortgage loan appraiser for the Prudential Insurance Company of America. I worked in Manitoba for the first few years, but in 1964 I transferred to Saskatoon, where Prudential's farm lending program had ended in 1934, 30 years before. I was given a dream assignment to assess the feasibility of reopening the farm lending program. This gave me a chance to do something that I dearly love to do, explore new territory, and get paid for the privilege. The company agreed that we should indeed reopen the farm lending program, and further agreed that I should be the one to do so. Canada is the second largest country in the world, exceeded in size only by Russia. Canada's 10 provinces and 3 territories range from very large, Nunavut, to very small, Prince Edward Island. Saskatchewan ranks 7th in land area, a few kilometers less than Alberta, but much larger than Manitoba. Although Saskatchewan makes up only 6.5% of Canada's total land area, it is the amount of land devoted to agriculture that puts Saskatchewan at the top of the list. It has 38.5% of Canada's total farmland. In addition, given my assignment to look at farmland throughout Saskatchewan as I drove mile after mile in Saskatchewan, I became aware of how incredible its road network was. Saskatchewan has more total road mileage, paved and unpaved, than any province or territory in Canada. Driving all those miles on Saskatchewan roads was unlikely to be without incident. A few road and driving stories follow. Prairie weather. The prairies of Canada, not surprisingly, have mid-continent weather. That means well-defined seasons, one might even say extreme seasons. None of your lily-livered, same thing day in, day out, tropical paradise stuff. I grew up where the weather was talked about, dealt with, even celebrated. There was pride in surviving what Mother Nature threw our way. The days grew shorter as fall approached, and by late December they were just 6 hours long. Then the days lengthened as spring approached, increasing to about 16 hours in June. Although the bitter cold of winter continued into the early months of the new year, the longer days were a cause for optimism. When at last my father saw a horned lark on a nearby fence post, usually the first migratory bird to arrive, he knew that spring was on its way and was much cheered by the prospect. As spring advanced, the disappearance of the winter snow was uneven. It melted most quickly in open areas, but lingered for weeks where there was more shelter from the sun, especially in the trees and on the north slopes of hills and valleys. Almost invariably in our area, the happy march towards spring would be interrupted by a blizzard and colder weather. Such uncertain weather would continue into May, and even on rare occasions into June. We would delay planting our garden until late May in the hope that we might have to cover tender plants only once or twice before all danger of frost had passed. I remember summers on the farm as very enjoyable times. I wasn't old enough to do men's work, but I enjoyed helping my mother. I could help with the garden, weeding, and gathering vegetables for meals. But the highlight of the summer was berry picking. The creeks, valleys, and bushes in our area were rich with many kinds of wild berries and other fruits native to the area, including cranberries, pin cherries, wild raspberries, wild strawberries, saskatoons, and gooseberries. Chokecherries also grew in abundance, but because of their astringent taste, my mother didn't make much use of them. As kids, we ate them by the handful, even though they made our mouths purple and puckery. Prairie wind. Old hands in the land inspection business know that on a windy day, when there are two of you in the car, you never open both doors at the same time. Rather, one person opens their door, gets out, and shuts it. Then the other person opens their door, gets out, and shuts it. If you open both doors at once, any papers that may be lying in the front seat area will be blown all over hell's half-acre. The windiest part of the prairies is southern Alberta, east of the Crow's Nest Pass, and eastward from there into southwest Saskatchewan. There is an easterly flow coming over the Rockies anyway, but it is particularly strong in southern Alberta. This is due to the Venturi effect of the Crow's Nest Pass. The strong flow of wind from the Pacific gets even stronger as it emerges from the pass. The city of Lethbridge, Alberta, is directly in the path of this airflow. The prevailing wind is such a factor in Lethbridge that many modern houses are built with no windows or doors in their west walls, and with patios and decks on the east side where there is some shelter from the prevailing wind. Alberta has installed hundreds of wind turbines in this area to take advantage of the prevailing winds. The turbines are built to handle winds from 10.8 to 90 kilometers per hour, with a nominal operating speed of 54 kilometers per hour. Swift Current, Saskatchewan, while not situated as close to or as directly in the Crow's Nest flow as are some southeastern Alberta places, is also very windy. I was once in Swift Current driving west on a gravel road facing into a very strong west wind. At one point there was a particularly strong blast just as I came up over a rise. The wind picked up a load of small stones and gravel which hit my windshield with such force that it was permanently pitted. After that, for as long as I owned that car, the pitting made it very difficult to drive when facing into a sun low in the sky. Why, you ask, didn't I get the windshield replaced? Answer, money, or more accurately, lack of money. Swift Current winters are not quite as cold as other parts of Saskatchewan, but sometimes when low temperatures are combined with strong winds, it can be brutally cold. One winter day, Swift Current had a temperature of minus 35 Fahrenheit, combined with an 80 mile per hour wind. This combination goes right off most wind chill charts, but if you really want to know, the wind chill that day was minus 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Nippy doesn't quite cover it. The Venturi effect works like this in this case. When the west wind is forced through a constriction, the Crow's Nest Pass, the increase in pressure on the upwind side and the corresponding decrease in pressure on the downwind side results in an increase in wind velocity. Just go and live in Pincher Creek or Lethbridge or Swift Current for a while and you'll see what I mean. Hailstorm, 1938. The crops failed on our Encliffe farm in Manitoba for 8 straight years, from 1930 to 1937 inclusive. The dirty 30s hit farmers next door in Saskatchewan harder than they hit us, but times were tough for us too. The rains finally returned in 1938, and the fields of grain were looking wonderful. My father and his parents still had their butcher shop in Russell, which is where Dad and Grandpa were when the hailstorm hit late in the afternoon of Monday, August 8, 1938. Dad had some business to attend to before driving back to the farm, while Grandpa was to stay the night with Grandma in the big house in Russell. The storm was the most severe to hit the Russell district in decades. Thunder and lightning and big hailstones and wind hit with a fury, breaking 4,000 panes of glass on the north and west-facing windows in the town. Leaves were stripped off the trees, and crops were completely flattened in the path of the storm. My grandfather was having supper when the storm hit. He and my grandmother were eating soup. She was a nervous type, he was not. He figured there was nothing he could do, so he just kept eating his soup. On the other hand, as various windows started breaking, Grandmother began running to and fro, wringing her hands and crying, "Whatever shall we do? Whatever shall we do?" And then running over to each window as it shattered and pulling the blinds down. The blinds, in turn, would be ripped from top to bottom by yet more hailstones coming through the now broken window. My grandfather, still eating his soup, kept saying, "Get away from the windows, woman." By this time, the rain and hail were piling onto the floors from the broken windows, so Grandma grabbed a broom and frantically started sweeping, which had no impact on the mess, but caused her to get more and more upset. Grandpa kept eating his soup. He figured there'd be time enough to clean up afterwards. These two had very different approaches in times of crisis. He was calmer than anyone I'd ever known. She got all aflutter at the slightest disturbance. Finally, a large hailstone hit the dining room floor so hard that it bounced up onto the table and splashed into Grandpa's soup bowl. He looked at it, then pushed his bowl away and said, "Well, I guess that's it." Even Grandpa had his limits. Meanwhile, Dad, having waited out the storm in another part of town, started driving home. The crops on both sides of the road were completely ruined, and the devastation continued even as he got closer and closer to home. He figured they were facing yet another financial disaster. Finally, our farmstead almost in sight, he saw that the storm had missed us by half a mile and that we were okay. My mother met him at the farm gate to confirm that our crop was okay. That was the year our farm began to emerge from the dirty 30s. Bailiffs. Another job my father and grandfather took on in the 1930s was that of bailiffs for their district in Manitoba. Although it was another income source for them, it was not pleasant work. It involved the seizing of goods and property on which debts were outstanding. However, they performed their duties with humanity and understanding, and their reputations as fair men grew as a result. They often were able to help both sides in the dispute to work out a payment arrangement whereby the property didn't actually have to be repossessed. Although that meant there would be no bailiff fee, they always had the greater good of the community in mind. Bad roads in our district. The roads in our Manitoba district were a challenge. In summer, when it rained, the silty clay turned to mud. In winter, the roads were often blocked with snow. The adults struggled and cursed or cried, depending on gender, but I enjoyed every minute of it. In those days, cars, trucks, and tractors were not used during the winter. Water was used as a coolant. Antifreeze was available, but most people couldn't afford it. So in cold weather, the water had to be drained out of the radiator and engine block to prevent damage from freezing when the vehicle was left sitting with the engine not running. In fact, one even had to be careful not to be caught off guard by freezing night temperatures in the spring and fall for fear of damaging the engine. This was a considerable risk where we lived because there was a danger of frost for much of the year. The only month in which there was never frost in that part of Manitoba was July. The growing season in our area averaged only 83 frost-free days, 40 fewer days than in Prairies. Furthermore, if you needed to get an internal combustion engine started in the dead of winter, you first had to put a container of hot coals under the oil pan. Our farm was not electrified, so we couldn't heat the engine with electricity. Then pour warm water, not too hot for fear of cracking the cast iron engine block, into the radiator, install a battery, kept warm in the kitchen overnight, and then try to start the engine, usually cranking it by hand. It would sometimes take most of the day to get the vehicle going, and the air would turn blue with curses during the attempt. We had a 1928 Chevrolet one-ton truck that was a fine piece of engineering for its time. It had no starter and had to be hand-cranked unless it could be parked facing down a small slope. It was wonderfully easy to start with a small forward roll. You could just put it in second gear, turn on the ignition, let it roll down the slope, engage the clutch, and the engine would start every time. When freeze-up arrived in the fall, we parked the truck for the winter facing down a small hill at the edge of the barnyard. Put blocks in front of the wheels, drained the water out of the radiator and engine, and removed the battery. In the spring, we would put the battery back in, fill the radiator with warm water, remove the blocks from in front of the wheels, roll the truck down the hill, and it would start first time every time, even after sitting there all winter. It was an extremely simple vehicle, easy to keep in repair, and never made a fuss about anything. With lots of snow and numerous storms, many rural people didn't try to drive at all during the winter. They put their car up on blocks to take the weight off the tires and resorted to horsepower for the season. The severe climate and poor roads meant that travel by horse was no bed of roses either. Various conveyances, all horse-drawn except for propeller-driven snowmobiles, were used. A cutter, a type of one-horse sleigh, sleigh box, a box mounted on runners and used for hauling everything from sheaves to firewood, hay rack, a large rack type structure used for hauling loose straw or hay, stone boat, usually used for removing stones from stony fields, horse-drawn toboggan, and van, an enclosed house on runners pulled by a team of horses. The most reliable way of getting around was on horseback, but not everyone could ride, and there was limited capacity for passengers and cargo. Sometimes in winter, even in difficult driving conditions, a trip by car was necessary, for example, to see a doctor or to spend Christmas with relatives. The challenge then would be to get the car started after it had been sitting in an unheated shed for weeks or months. Manitoba Roads 1. Manitoba has generous 1.5 chain, that is 99 foot, road allowances, but the development of the roads within the allowances varied widely. Some of the road allowances ran through crop or pasture land where the farmer simply farmed the road allowance along with his land on both sides, and where no road had ever been developed. Others had only dirt trails through the prairie. Others had dirt roads which were graded occasionally but not raised above the surrounding terrain. Still other roads had road beds that were graded up above the surrounding terrain for improved drainage. These were all mud roads and therefore difficult or impassable for motorized vehicles when it rained. The closest gravel road to our farm was 3 miles away, and we were 6 miles from the 2-lane gravel highway leading into Russell, the major town in the area. We were 1.5 miles from the village of Encliffe. Although these distances do not seem far, road conditions of the day often made even short trips difficult. This was in the days before four-wheel drive vehicles were common, so many of the roads in our district were next to impassable for rear-drive only motorized vehicles when it rained in the summer or during spring breakup, and were difficult or totally blocked by snow in winter. There were places on the road to Encliffe where the road would be underwater when the sloughs on each side were high, especially during spring breakup. Manitoba Roads 2. In Manitoba's severe climate, winter roads went through several stages. A sleigh passing over the first snows of the fall left 2 parallel sleigh runner tracks. Sleigh runners act on snow in the same way as skis do on snow, or skates on ice. The pressure causes a thin layer of snow to melt, allowing the runners to glide along easily. On a cold day, this water freezes immediately into an icy surface where the runner has passed. As the snows continued through the fall and winter, more snow got packed onto the sleigh tracks, building them up higher and higher. Here, the deep snow of a Manitoba winter again had an effect. The snow and ice crystals, frozen and packed tightly together by the weight of the sleigh traffic, formed a very strong structure, allowing the tracks to hold up well no matter how heavily loaded the sleigh. Then there was the wind. Sometimes it would blow during a snowfall, especially during a blizzard. Sometimes it would just blow, even on a sunny day. A strong wind would pick up loose snow already on the ground and move it along. Snow-laden wind produced snowdrifts, some of which were enormous. Many road allowances in our rural area were not cleared of bushes and trees adjacent to the road itself, so big drifts would build up across the road. Getting a team and a heavily laden sleigh through and over such drifts could be very difficult, often involving hard work with shovels, struggling horses, and considerable time. Loaded horse-drawn vehicles sometimes got into trouble in these areas of deep snow. Any horse that stepped off the track would sink in so deeply that it couldn't get up again. When a horse sinks into snow up to or almost up to its withers, it has to use extraordinary measures to get out. It has to plunge, using the power of its hind legs to raise its front legs above the snow. Then it has to add the power from its front legs to move its body up and out of the snow. Add to this the horse is in a state of panic and anxiety about freeing itself. Injury was a distinct possibility to anyone who tried to assist the horse by pulling on the bridle or shoveling to clear the snow. You never knew when a nervous horse would begin plunging to get out of its deep trap of snow. Add to that the difficulty for humans of moving around in the deep snow while trying to stay out of the way of those flailing front legs, and you had a recipe for injury. Out in the open, the drifting snow would remove loose snow on both sides of the packed tracks, but would not affect the tracks themselves. As a result, the tracks became higher than the snow on each side. As the winter wore on, travel on these elevated tracks became more and more hazardous, especially when one track was higher than the other. A heavily loaded sleigh or rack could easily tip over or lose part of its load, to the great consternation of whoever was accompanying the load. If the dead of winter was bad for travel with team and sleigh, spring was worse. As the sun grew in strength and the snow began to soften, the snow crystal structures supporting the raised tracks began to weaken. The problem was that the two tracks didn't weaken evenly, especially on east-west roads, where the spring sun would soften the south track more quickly than the north one. This meant that the sleigh would cut or sink into the south track more than the north track. The sleigh would thus travel for miles at a tilt, ranging from mild to severe to upset. Horse-drawn vans. I should describe in more detail the winter conveyance known as a van. Vans were a mixed blessing. It was much warmer riding in a van in cold weather, but it was also dangerous. A van was, essentially, a small wooden house on runners, pulled by a team of horses. The door was usually at the rear, but occasionally on the side. There was always a window at the front with two holes underneath through which the driver held the reins. Sometimes there were windows at the side, too. There were benches along each side and a wood stove in one front corner with a stovepipe protruding through the roof. The stove was usually not securely held in position, but simply positioned there, sitting on 3 bricks and held in place by wire. Not only were the occupants protected from the biting wind, but the wood fire provided some warmth. It was a cozy way to get around, especially when traveling several miles to an evening social event such as a party, concert, or dance. In contrast, those traveling in open-air conveyances such as a cutter, sleigh box, or hay rack would have to bundle up as much as possible. Even so, they would be so cold they could hardly move by the end of their journey. If an upset happened with a van, however, there was no doubt that it was potentially more dangerous than with open-air conveyances. Tipping over in an open-air conveyance simply meant everyone and everything got thrown out into the snow or bushes or whatever was beside the road, followed by a struggle to right the vehicle and find and reload everyone and everything that had been dumped. On the other hand, an upset in a van was a very serious matter, especially at night. Imagine being in a van flipped onto its side with people on the bench on the upper side landing on top of those on the bottom in pitch darkness, the stove having come loose from its moorings, spilling smoke, fire, and hot coals all over the driver and the passengers. Plus, the team of horses might be spooked by the upset and start plunging about or running away, dragging the upset van behind them. Trying to control a skittish team from inside an upset van was, to say the least, a challenge for the driver. Vans were of every conceivable size and design, with little or no thought for safety. There was no such thing as safety glass, for example. The hazardous wood stove has already been mentioned. Then there was the door. The door on most vans was in the rear. However, some vans were built with the door on the side, which could be disastrous in the event of an upset. With the van on its side, the door would be either on the top or the bottom. If on the top, climbing out, especially in the dark, when trying to escape from the contents of the upset stove, could be very difficult. If on the bottom, escape was impossible. A design from hell, no question about it. A rear door at least offered the possibility of escape. Upsetting in a horse-drawn van in those days was the very definition of pandemonium. Ice harvesting. One of the winter jobs in our district of Encliffe, Manitoba was ice harvesting. The best time for gathering the ice was in February, when the ice in the rivers and lakes was at its thickest, and when the days were getting longer, the sun a bit stronger, and the cold not quite as bitter. This was a job best done on a work-bee basis, with several farmers cooperating to help each other to bring in enough ice for the summer. The work was heavy and dangerous, requiring skill as well as physical strength. Lakes were safer than rivers, where the ice could vary in thickness because of the current below. 3 or 4 neighbors usually worked together, bringing teams of horses pulling sleigh boxes with about 2 men per sleigh, for a total workforce of 8. There were 3 primary tools of the trade: axes, ice saws, and ice tongs. Here's how the work would proceed. First, a hole would be chopped in the ice down to water level. It takes quite a while to chop through 4 feet of ice with an axe. This was before hand-operated or power augers were common. The ice saw would then be used until the first block floated free. An ice saw is a long, coarse saw with a double handle at one end. In contrast, a tree saw, before the days of chainsaws, has, with fairly coarse teeth, a handle at both ends. My more discerning readers will only take a moment to figure out why a handle is not needed at both ends of an ice saw. Once the first block was removed, it became easier to saw and free up additional blocks to be loaded onto the sleighs. The blocks were so heavy, 100 to 150 pounds each, that it took 2 strong men with ice tongs to swing the blocks up onto a sleigh. The danger increased block by block as the work proceeded, because the expanse of open water increased as each block was taken out, and the surface surrounding the open water got slipperier and slipperier. Each block hauled out brought water with it, which immediately froze, leaving an icy ring along the edge. The risk of falling into the open water increased minute by minute because of the growing expanse of open water as the ice was removed, and the wet, slippery conditions around the edge, which tended to slope toward the hole. My father lived in fear lest he would fall in during ice harvesting. He couldn't swim and had a fear of water to begin with, but he knew that falling in this situation would be much worse than merely falling out of a boat or off a pier in summer. Falling into an ice harvesting hole where there was a current meant that there was an immediate danger of being swept under the ice. There was also the likelihood of hypothermia setting in within minutes in the cold water. Even if you were pulled out of the water quickly, hypothermia was likely anyway, because you could be an hour to several hours away from the nearest house, where you could get out of your wet clothing and get warm. Much of the published history of ice harvesting refers to community and commercial operations in northern USA, where much more advanced techniques were used than in the small communities in the Canadian prairies where we lived. Still, providing ice for the ice house was essential for preserving food in summer and was a constant source of fascination for farm kids. Firewood and the farm. Another job that had to be done in winter on the farm was getting firewood. Our farm had a wood-burning kitchen stove for cooking, baking, and heating water, and a very old gravity circulation hot air furnace in the basement for space heating. Getting firewood was a winter job because with the ground, sloughs, and bogs all frozen, much more of the bush was accessible. Plus, farmers had more time in the winter for such jobs. There were 6 labor-intensive steps to the operation: felling the trees, limbing the trees, hauling them to the farmyard, sawing the logs into stovewood lengths, splitting the cut lengths for burning, and if time and labor allowed, piling the split wood into neat rows. On our farm, we usually got most of the splitting done, but there was never enough spare time or labor to make things neat, so the wood was mostly left in a big heap, commonly known as a woodpile. As with ice harvesting, the methods used in our district were primitive. Chainsaws were not yet in use in our area, so axes were used for all steps of the operation except final sawing of the logs to length. On most farms in our district, this was done by a custom wood sawing outfit that went from farm to farm. Once the trees were felled and the limbs chopped off, the logs were pulled out to a clearing with horses, manhandled onto a sleigh, and hauled to the farmyard, where they were stacked awaiting the arrival of the sawing outfit. When the outfit arrived, along with neighbors to help, the sawing bee could begin. The machine would be powered either by its own dedicated engine or by a tractor driving a belt. The round saw blade was unguarded and 30 to 36 inches in diameter. The logs were loaded one at a time onto a tilt table, where stove wood lengths of about 14 inches were cut off with each forward tilt of the table. It took 3 men to handle the logs on the tilt table. Other members of the work bee would be getting more logs into position, ready to be loaded onto the table. There was a gender-based division of labor in a sawing bee. Men outside dealing with the logs, and women inside keeping the men fed and watered. The unguarded screaming blade was another example of the extremely unsafe farming practices of the time. The 2 men most in danger were the one on the tilt table immediately to the left of the blade, and even more at risk, the one immediately to the right of the blade, catching the cut lengths and tossing them onto a pile behind him. One of the problems, especially for the guy catching the cut lengths, was the poor footing below the blade, which consisted, as the work progressed, of more and more sawdust mixed with snow and ice, splinters, twigs, scraps of log, and the odd cut length that had rolled off the pile behind him and underfoot. The guy on the tilt table at least had the table to help keep him steady. The guy on the right simply had to keep his balance and not fall into the blade. It became even worse as the noise, fatigue, monotony, and over-familiarity with the operation reduced attentiveness. In addition, it was not unknown for the blade to come off its shaft or break apart. The crew would then be treated to the sight of the blade or parts of it screaming its way across the barnyard until its high speed of rotation finally wound down. You had to hope, if that happened, that you were not in its path, because death was likely, or at the very least, the loss of assorted bits of your anatomy. Once the day's custom sawing was done and the outfit and neighbors had left, there remained the job of splitting the cut lengths into burnable pieces. Ideally, the firewood being burned would be from last year's cutting, so it would have had a chance to dry out for better burning. Being that far ahead of the curve was not a common thing on our farm. There was usually at best only a small pile left by the time the new supply was brought in. This meant having to burn a lot of green wood. The hope was that a few of the logs taken would be dead trees and some dry wood obtained that way. Another problem was that almost all our firewood was poplar, common name quaking aspen, scientific name Populus tremuloides, which doesn't produce a very hot fire and leaves a lot of ash. Chimney fires. We burned a lot of green poplar on our farm, which resulted in a considerable buildup of creosote in our stovepipes and chimneys. This was a recipe for fire because, as creosote, a residue left from incomplete combustion of wood, builds up inside the pipes and chimneys, it restricts and slows down the flow of smoke and flue gases to the outside, allowing a dangerous temperature rise inside the pipes. Creosote is a good insulator, which makes the heat buildup even worse. It is also extremely flammable, with an ignition point of about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Our kitchen stove, an old-fashioned cast-iron cook stove, was the main source of heat in the kitchen and had to be kept going all day. A stovepipe rose from the stove, elbowed to a horizontal pipe running along about 12 inches below the ceiling, and elbowed again into a hole leading to the brick chimney, which passed through the second-floor hallway and into the attic through the roof. Mum, with Grandpa Shipley's help, would clean the pipes once a winter, a really dirty job. The horizontal pipes were held in place with stovepipe wire, so named because so much of it was needed to keep stovepipes suspended in those days, wrapped around the pipes and through screw eyes in the ceiling. The pipes, 8 inches in diameter and in 36-inch sections, had to be taken apart, carried outside, and banged and shaken to get the soot and creosote out, then carried back into the house and put together again. There was no way to get the pipes apart without spilling a lot of soot and creosote out of both ends of each section. This black, greasy mixture would get all over everything in the kitchen, resulting in kitchen walls, ceiling, floors, and furniture having to be washed afterwards. This meant half a day taking the pipes down and cleaning them out, putting them back up again, followed by half a day cleaning up. Today we would start with the vacuum cleaner, but back then with no electricity, that was not an option. It meant heating water on the stove using non-detergent, usually homemade soap, and scrubbing, then heating more water on the stove and rinsing everything to get rid of the soap film. I don't remember the chimney ever being cleaned. No doubt it should have been, but at least it got cleared out by the occasional fire. In spite of cleaning the pipes once a year, I remember stovepipe and chimney fires occurring. It would be a cold winter day with a hot fire going in the stove. All of a sudden there would be a tremendous roar like a freight train going by, and the pipes would begin to glow red, and flames and sparks would shoot out of the chimney. This provided several opportunities for burning the house down. The burning pipes could come apart and fall to the floor, spreading fire all over the place. Or the heat from the pipes could set fire to the painted wooden ceiling 12 inches above them. Or the sparks shooting out of the chimney and landing on the wooden shingles could set the roof alight. Nice to have all those options. Many farmhouses burned to the ground during the winter in those days. Everyone knew the danger, knew what to do, and knew it had to be done fast. The challenge was to act before something else caught fire. The first thing to do would be to direct a fire extinguisher onto the flames, but failing that, the next best thing was to throw a package of baking soda onto the fire in the stove. This would release carbon dioxide up into the pipes and up the chimney, starving the fire of oxygen. We never had a pipe or chimney fire spread to the house. If we had, there would have been no way of putting it out. There was no fire department to call and not enough water for a bucket brigade to make much difference. The house would simply have burned down, with us, we hoped, outside watching rather than inside dying in the fire. Snowmobiles of the day. The most dramatic mode of winter transport in the farm country of Manitoba at that time was the propeller-driven snowmobile. There were various designs, but essentially they consisted of a small enclosed van mounted on skis and propelled by a rear-mounted gasoline engine driving a rear-facing propeller. These machines were home-built, powerful, fast, noisy, and based on the ones I saw, unbelievably dangerous. The main problem was that the propeller was usually not enclosed in a protective cage, but was simply out there spinning at blinding speed, able to chop anyone who ventured too close into small pieces. Propeller-driven airplanes also have unprotected propellers, of course, but at least airplanes spend most of their time up in the air, where no one can inadvertently walk into the propeller. There's also a safety protocol associated with flying, and pilots are licensed. Propeller-driven snowmobiles, on the other hand, were on the ground all the time, where the possibility of having bits chopped off one's person was ever present, and where the phrase safety protocol did not readily spring to mind. These machines were certainly dramatic as they roared over the landscape, leaving everything in their wake, including large clouds of flying snow, not to mention bits of any bystanders who had ventured too close to the propeller. Sheepish. Animals were an important part of our life on the farm in Manitoba, particularly the sheep. We had as many as 300 ewes. My grandfather Shipley called them yos, which, as the new lambs came in ones, twos, and occasionally threes, resulted in a total of at least 600 sheep roaming the place at one time. Coyotes eventually became a major menace for our large flock. Interestingly, during the Second World War, the noise from a shooting range a mile or so from our farm kept the coyotes back in the bush. After the war, when the shooting range was shut down, the coyotes became much bolder and began killing sheep, especially lambs. They caused so many losses that it became uneconomic to keep such a large flock. There are a number of significant times in a sheep operation: lambing time, shearing, docking, that is removing the tails, dipping, taking the lambs to market, and selling the wool. Lambing time was an exhausting business on our farm. Most of the lambs were born in April, when the weather was almost always cold, with snow or cold rain or a mixture of both. We did not have adequate shelter for the flock, so most of the lambs were born out in the open pasture. or at best in a lean-to open on one side. And of course they were born at any hour, day or night. Sometimes the ewe would need help to deliver the lambs, sometimes not. Sometimes the lambs would begin to suckle immediately, but sometimes there were difficulties. And sometimes the ewe would have enough milk for twins, not enough for triplets. It was a constant struggle to reduce the number of newborns dying from exposure by moving the mother sheep and her lambs under shelter, while at the same time turning the mother with stronger lambs that could handle the elements out to pasture again to make room for the newborns. Then there were the very weak ones that would die if not given special care. This involved having lambs all over the kitchen, including 2 or 3 lying on the open oven door, or trying to get a few drops of cow's milk into them to give them enough strength to be able to go back outside and stand and suckle from their mother. Occasionally a ewe would die, leaving us with orphan lambs to deal with. We then had to find a ewe with milk to spare, either because she was a good milk producer or because her own lamb or lambs had died. The next challenge was to get the ewe to accept the orphan. Her instinct usually drove her to reject all lambs except her own. However, some ewes were less particular than others and would readily accept a strange lamb. Sometimes we had to skin the dead lamb and wrap the orphan in the dead lamb's skin so it had the right smell for the adoptive mother to accept it. This grisly step usually worked. Sometimes we could not find mothers for orphans and had to bottle feed the orphan lambs with cow's milk. These then became pet lambs and were a source of joy and fun for everybody, especially my sister and me, whose job it was to give the lambs their bottles. The lambs would come when called, enthusiastically skipping and jumping across the field to where we were waiting. Lambs at play are a joy to watch. Seen through human eyes, they're just having fun, when what they're really doing is building health and strength by being active. It was less chaotic if we fed the lambs through the page wire fence that separated the house yard from the night pasture. If we let them inside the fence, they would crowd around and there would be so much pushing and shoving that it would be impossible to avoid spilling the milk in the pail when refilling the bottles. Also, as the lambs grew in size, there was a chance that my little sister would get knocked over. Lambing time was a 2-week, 24-hour-a-day marathon. Vigilance was the watchword. Saving the lambs that would otherwise have died made the difference between profit and loss in the sheep enterprise on our farm. Saving the lambs that would otherwise have died made the difference between profit and loss in the sheep enterprise on our farm. Saving them meant getting out of bed every hour or so and circulating quietly through the flock to see which ewes were going into labor and which needed help, and getting them under shelter for the birthing or immediately afterwards. The miserable weather and lack of sleep often meant one or more of the shepherds would catch a cold, making the vigil all the more unpleasant. Sheep dip. Sheep can be affected by various external parasites that feed on their wool, skin, and even their flesh. Traditionally, sheep farmers have put their sheep through pits of water containing some unpleasant chemicals such as arsenic, copper, and zinc. More recently, modern organophosphate insecticides have been used, thus bringing the dip mixture into the modern age. Bigger farms can afford elaborate spraying equipment, which is faster, more efficient, and wastes less solution. Small operations like ours put our sheep through a dip pit, a more labor-intensive and wasteful operation. We had a sheep dip pit in a pasture not far from our farmstead. It was about 3 feet deep, had vertical walls, and an entrance and exit ramp at each end. The whole structure was lined with lumber. The pits sat unused except when the sheep needed treatment before shearing time. The pit was not close to a stream or slough, so the risk of runoff contamination was minimal. I don't know whether this favorable location was chosen through good management or accident. Wherever it was, this was an example of something on our farm being done right for a change. Dipping day was a lot of work. The sheep had to be herded into a holding pasture with a fence that would channel the sheep towards the dip tank. It was all hands on deck, gathering the flock together, getting it moving in the direction of the tank, and finally making sure that each sheep was completely dunked under the dip mixture. Shearing time. Shearing time was very interesting for a kid. We had a sizable flock of sheep on the farm, but because of my grandfather's experience and expertise gained in England, we did the shearing ourselves instead of hiring a custom outfit to do it for us. As a kid, I was a keen observer of the whole operation. There was much activity as the sheep were herded into the corral in the barnyard, ready to be caught and brought one at a time to the shearing station. We had two shearing systems, hand clippers and mechanical. The hand clippers were vicious-looking, spring-loaded shears. My grandfather Shipley was quite skilled with these. The mechanical system was mounted on an upright stand with a hand crank, turning an articulated arm with a cutting head attached. After shearing, the sheep huddled together looking very self-conscious, as if they'd suddenly found themselves in a shopping mall in their underwear. It is almost certain that breathing in the fumes of the dip mixture posed a health threat to the workers, but little was known or questioned in that day. Sheep. Elsewhere in this book, I give turkeys a hard time about not being the brightest bulbs in the barnyard. Traditionally, sheep are also near the head of the lineup for the dunce cap. There's good reason for referring to people who follow the crowd without independent thought as being like sheep. Reports of the economic meltdown of 2008-2009 included numerous references to the sheep-like behavior of the Wall Street moguls and mortgage bankers. If those guys were in my barnyard, I'd have them heading up the sheep contingent in the dunce cap lineup. They might even get moved ahead of turkeys. Anyway, let's leave Wall Street and get back to the barnyard where the smell isn't quite as bad. Our flock of sheep brought in much needed money in the 30s and added to the profits in the improved financial picture of the 40s. But raising sheep had its problems. If one sheep found a hole in the fence, she would wriggle through it to be followed immediately by the rest of the flock. They figured that's what sheep are supposed to do, act like sheep. A pregnant sheep carrying one lamb can manage fairly well on her own, but a ewe carrying twins or triplets can get into difficulty near the end of her term. For example, if she lay down after eating grass and happened to roll back too far, the lambs would shift, flipping the mother onto her back, a position from which she could not get up. You would then be treated to the sight of one or more of these mothers lying on their backs, waving their legs in the air, completely helpless. If no one helped them back onto their feet, they would die, along with their lambs. Once on their feet, they had to be guided as they staggered around until the two lambs, high in their centers of gravity, dropped back down. In the spring, a ewe would sometimes walk into a slough and head into reeds or bushes and not be able to get out. I remember my dad rolling up his trouser legs and wading in to turn the sheep around and head her back out again. This was a painful experience because it always happened in the spring when the water was only a degree or two above freezing. The only reason I can think of this behavior was that the ewe had been dreamily watching the ducks swimming about and temporarily thought she was a duck. A similar thing occasionally happened in winter when the snow was deep. For some reason, a ewe would head into a snowbank, followed of course by the rest of the flock. If the head ewe couldn't get through the snowbank, she would get more stuck by the minute as the rest of the flock kept pushing forward, jamming her in even more solidly. This would mean that the farmer would have to don his shepherd's cap and push, lift, and manhandle the stupid lead sheep out of the snowbank to get the flock going in the right direction again. Raising sheep in a free-range situation, the only kind of situation we had back then, was a challenge. Recent research has shown that sheep are actually very intelligent, right up there with the smartest animals on the planet. Their behavior didn't give us that impression back on the farm, but maybe they decided that it was to their advantage to play dumb, and they were actually just laughing at us all along. Diabolically dangerous. Horses were the main power source on our Endcliffe farm until the acquisition in the mid-1930s of a used steel-wheeled Fordson tractor. After that, horses and the tractor were both used for pulling until we left the farm in 1947. The Fordson was a diabolically dangerous tractor. It had a short body, a grabby clutch, and a tendency to flip over backward. An example, the tractor would be operating in the field pulling a plow or a one-way disc implement and going along quite well until the whole outfit would be brought to a halt by a buried rock, causing the tractor, if it didn't stall, to flip backwards on top of the unfortunate operator. Or the tractor would go into a low spot and get stuck, which happened quite often given that we were in the pothole country of northwest Manitoba. As the driver tried to get the rig out, the steel rear wheels would quickly dig in until the tractor was tilted upwards at a considerable angle. That was when the situation became dangerous, because even when the implement was unhitched, the tractor was just as likely to flip over backwards as it was to climb out of the hole. Our hired men knew the dangers, so when it appeared that the tractor was ready to flip backwards, they would simply get off and walk back to the farmstead to get Dad to deal with it. Dad would get into the driver's seat and gingerly get the beast out, sometimes with the front wheels lifting ominously as the tractor decided whether to climb or flip. That tractor was certainly dangerous when working in the field, but it had another way of getting rid of surplus farmers. It was inclined to catch fire when used for driving a belt. That little trick was achieved because of another serious design flaw, whereby the exhaust manifold was located immediately below the carburetor, which in turn was immediately below the gasoline tank. Adding to the fact that it was very difficult to keep the carburetor from dripping gasoline onto the exhaust manifold below. Let me add a general aside at this point. All machinery and equipment and their components were much more prone to breaking down than they are today. Everything was mechanical. The electronics of today, with their amazing reliability, had not yet arrived, and everything down to the smallest, least significant part was not as good quality as it is today. Even if it was good quality, it would keep getting out of adjustment. Breaking down stood in the way of getting things accomplished in those days. So picture this. It's a hot harvest time day. The tractor's pulley is driving the belt for the threshing machine. Rack loads of sheaves are being hauled from the field and fed into the threshing machine. Dried chaff is flying all over the place, and straw is piling up around the machinery. There's a lot of noise and activity. The tractor operator is keeping one eye on the tractor while continuously checking that the threshing machine is working properly. The tractor is running well, but the danger of fire is extreme, with little drops of gasoline dripping from time to time from the carburetor onto the almost red-hot exhaust manifold below. There's a hiss as each droplet immediately vaporizes. It's difficult to imagine a worse fire hazard this side of hell. Suddenly, someone yells, "Tractor's on fire!" Everyone runs away from the expected explosion as flames flash around the carburetor and begin to lick up around the gas tank. Sorry, I'm not totally accurate here. Everyone except my father runs away from the expected explosion. He runs toward it and begins frantically throwing dirt on the fire. He always managed to smother the flames before an explosion happened, more through good luck than good management. Although if good management includes extremely fast and frantic action, there was certainly plenty of that. Good management apparently also included a considerable amount of profanity, during which the name of the Ford Motor Company did not come out looking good. Today, Ford would have been swamped with lawsuits, but nobody thought of that back then. Even the Lord above didn't escape having his name taken most emphatically in vain. Profanity was the only recourse available. Later, my father would explain why he always ran toward the fire. He said we were so poor that if the outfit and any of the buildings blew up, he might as well blow up with them because the loss would put us under anyway. Saskatchewan roads. I loved driving the back roads of the prairies, whether gravel or dirt. Dirt roads became mud roads in wet weather. No matter, I loved the challenge, even getting stuck and having to get out. I would still rather get stuck in the mud of a prairie dirt road than drive Highway 401 in Ontario. My kids have me figured out. We did a lot of driving as a family when we lived in Botswana, and I loved, nay reveled in, the fun of driving the four-wheel drive Toyota Land Cruiser on the difficult Botswana roads, whether those roads were of mud or deep sand. Deep sand was a conundrum. I had no experience with it. But getting stuck in mud, even with lions and elephants looking on, was just part of the fun for me, although the lions and elephants did not seem impressed. Saskatchewan has a surprising percentage of Canada's total road mileage, most of it rural, most of it dirt, much of it remote. Statistics Canada reports that Saskatchewan has 21.9% of Canada's improved roads, paved or gravel, with some 44% of Canada's agricultural land, and with road or at least road allowances every mile running east to west and every 2 miles running north to south. Saskatchewan probably has at least 40% of Canada's total road mileage. I love driving those roads, whatever the weather, whatever the conditions. Here's an example of the kind of fun I had. In the spring of 1967, I was looking at farmland in the Melfort area. I was on a good, drivable gravel road. The spring runoff was at its peak, so both ditches were full to the brim. I had about 2 miles to go to get a good look at the land in question, but found myself blocked by a big snowdrift that angled across the road. The drift was about 2 car lengths across, and the side facing me had a steep wall of snow about 12 inches high, rising to about 18 inches at the midpoint of the drift. It was late in the afternoon, so I didn't have time to walk the 4 miles there and back before it got dark. I got out to have a closer look, hoping that I could take a run at it and get over the drift so I could complete my inspection by car. Upon looking more closely, I could see that because of the angle of the drift across the road and the steep 12-inch front wall of the bank, there was a chance the car would be thrown sideways into the ditch full of water. I didn't want that, but thought that some strategic shoveling might prevent that from happening. The drift was quite hard, but using the shovel, I lowered the facing wall of snow and cut a track for each wheel. I thought the 2 tracks would help keep the car straight so that I might get through. Back in the car, I reversed, then shifted into forward and hit the bank at speed. The channel I had shoveled acted as a guide and kept me from being thrown sideways. My momentum almost got me over the whole bank, but not quite. I got stuck half a car length from the other side of the drift. I had to do another 10 minutes of shoveling and then got through. I completed my inspection and headed back to my friend the snowdrift. This time I had my ruts to follow, so I hit it at considerable speed and got right through. Most people would say I was nuts to try it, but it got the job done and I headed back to my motel for the night. Getting unstuck. Part of our family lore says that Dad, me, enjoys getting stuck. Although my first reaction is that this is an exaggeration, I have to admit that there is some truth to it. I've had a lot of experience getting stuck in mud holes and snowbanks and then getting myself out, and I've learned some things in the process. Except for the few times when I got a McCurdy Supply dump truck stuck at a construction site, I've almost never had to call for a tow. Come to think of it, many of the places I've been stuck in were too remote to ever expect a tow truck to come, even if I did call one. I'd have had a better chance of getting help by walking to the nearest farm to ask the farmer if he would pull me out with his tractor. But if I had simply given up and called for help each time I got stuck, I wouldn't have been able to write this Getting Unstuck piece for this book, and that would never do. A technique that can be useful for getting unstuck is called rocking. The stuck driver alternates between forward and reverse in the hope that the car will move back and forth. Even if the car will move only 2 inches back and forth, there's hope of getting out. You keep the car going forward and back, trying to extend the distance each time. Then if you sense that the car is climbing a little hill as it reaches one end of the run, you apply the brakes to hold the car on that little hill while you prepare to go in the other direction. The extra momentum from going down a little hill may be enough to get you unstuck. If the rocking technique doesn't get you out, you'll have to do some digging. That's when having a shovel in the car can mean the difference between getting unstuck yourself and having to call for a tow. Some shoveling techniques are good, some are useless. Let's say you're stuck in snow. The first thing to do is to clear the snow from all around all 4 wheels, including the sides, but especially a foot or so in front and behind each wheel. Then get back in the driver's seat and try rocking the car again. If you still don't get out, there's another shoveling technique to try. This involves digging a small trough about 6 inches long in front of and behind each wheel. This will leave each wheel up on a small hill, so as the car moves down into the little trough, it may gain enough momentum to get unstuck. These techniques also work in mud, although shoveling is usually harder in mud than in snow. It's natural to like something you're good at. I don't actually look for opportunities to get stuck, but when it happens, I'm fairly confident I can get out. It's not actually enjoyable to get stuck, so I think the family lore is a bit exaggerated when it says that Dad enjoys getting stuck. Let's just say it's not the end of the world when it happens. Grit roads. Not many drivers would say this, but dirt roads are my favorite. Next come gravel roads, then old-fashioned 2-lane paved roads. After that, it's a toss-up for which I like least. Highway 401 through Toronto, or an interstate highway going past any big U.S. city you care to name. I'm a country boy at heart. The less traffic, the better. As the piece above shows, I don't even mind getting stuck, especially when there's no one around to make uncomplimentary remarks about how any fool should have known that he was likely to get stuck in that mud hole or snowbank. Despite my enthusiasm for bad roads, I know how frustrating and unproductive it can be for farmers to have nothing but dirt roads around their farm. If the weather is not good, you can't haul grain or produce to town for sale, and you can't go to town for groceries, parts, or supplies. You can't get to the doctor if someone gets sick or has an accident. The list goes on. If you absolutely have to get to town for some reason, you go, get stuck, dig yourself out, or return for a horse or tractor to pull your vehicle through the mud hole and force your way along until you reach a passable gravel or paved road. This, of course, was in the days before four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive vehicles were common. Thus, when the Saskatchewan government introduced, and even more importantly, implemented the grid road program, it was well received. The idea was that there would be a grid pattern of good roads all over the province. These were narrow, 2-lane roads graded up above the surrounding fields for good drainage in summer and to allow snow to blow off in winter, and covered with a gravel surface. As gravel roads go, they were excellent, a huge improvement over the field-level dirt roads of the past. It meant that a passable road was within a mile or two, or at worst a few miles away from every farm gate. The program included maintenance, by which the roads were regularly graded to bring the gravel back up from the edges, to smooth out potholes and corrugations, and to maintain the crown in the middle of the road. Fresh gravel was added when necessary. Saskatchewan farmers knew that it was gravel that made these roads different from the dirt roads they had been used to. It was gravel, the grit, that allowed your tires to gain traction in the rain or during spring breakup. Government technology notwithstanding, the grid roads quickly became commonly known as grit roads, a much more descriptive term. Buried fences. On one memorable occasion, my farm appraisal work took me about 40 miles, 64 kilometers, north of Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, through a range of hills and down to an isolated basin of productive farmland, to see a farm operated by a good farmer in this amazingly isolated area. As we drove around his fields, one trail led between two embankments along each side of the road. The embankments were so high that we couldn't see his land. We had to stop the car from time to time and climb up the embankment so I could have a look. I asked him, "What are we standing on?" He said there were 3 upright fences buried under our feet. The fences had been buried during the 30s as a result of a combination of Russian thistle and drifting soil. During this decade of unprecedented drought and dust storms of the 1930s, the only plant that grew well on the cultivated land was Russian thistle, the Canadian tumbleweed. This annual plant was well adapted to drought and wind in the following ways. It grew rapidly from seed each spring, needing very little moisture to germinate. In late summer, as it ripened, its stem at the ground level weakened, allowing the wind to break it off. The plant's round shape then allowed the wind to roll and bounce it across the field, which in turn shook thousands of seeds from its ripened seed pods, scattering them everywhere, ready to germinate next spring. The farmer's father, who operated the farm before him, had at one point fenced his fields for livestock. During the Depression, the bouncing tumbleweed came to rest against the fences, creating a tangled wall of Russian thistle. This in turn slowed the drifting soil, causing it to pile up within and around the Russian thistle, eventually creating a solid bank of soil. Drought-tolerant vegetation followed, and pretty soon there was no indication at all that a fence was buried there. This cycle was repeated 3 times during the 30s, resulting in 3 buried fences, one on top of the other, beneath our feet. A spectacular illustration of wind erosion and soil movement some 80 years before. Elrose Jaguar. I worked along the Rosetown-Elrose Highway in Saskatchewan in the 1960s and 70s as part of my farm appraisal work for Prudential Insurance, my first job after university. I often stopped in Elrose for lunch or a coffee break. That's where I heard this story about the doctor with the Jaguar. The doctor in Elrose in the early 1960s had a fine, fast Jaguar car that he had brought with him from England. It was well suited to the wide, straight, newly paved highways in that part of Saskatchewan. It was not well suited to Saskatchewan winters. In fact, the word around town was that it was so bad it started in cold conditions that if you walked by it on a hot summer day holding an ice cream cone, it wouldn't start. However, with a top speed of 120 miles per hour, it was certainly the fastest car around. Some other cars, all American made, showed more than 100 miles per hour on the speedometer, but most were unstable menaces at more than 80. The Jag was also right-hand drive, which made it even odder to the locals. One summer day, a teenager had his dad's new Oldsmobile out for a run and decided to see if he could get it up to 100 miles per hour. The young driver had just pushed the Olds up to the target 100 miles per hour when, as he held the steering wheel with a white-knuckle grip, he heard an engine snort beside him. It was the doctor, in his Jag, sitting, of course, on the right side, who shouted, "Good afternoon, Rodney. Lovely day." Rodney was only able to glance to his left and nod nervously when the doctor added, "Well, mustn't dilly-dally around," and with another snort, the Jag easily left the Olds behind. Nobody moved. I worked in the Extension Division of the University of Saskatchewan in the late 60s and 70s. My colleague Glenn Haas and another University of Saskatchewan staff had attended a winter 4-H event in the town of Hudson Bay, at that time near the end of the road system in northeast Saskatchewan. After the event, they were facing a long, difficult drive back to Saskatoon. On a nice summer day, it would have been a 4-hour drive. But this was a cold winter evening with light snow and icy roads, so who knew how long the drive was going to take? Glenn, a very skilled driver, was taking great care on the hilly, winding roads, trying to avoid spinning out of control or skidding into the ditch. They came over a rise, and there at the bottom of the hill stood a big moose, complete with an impressive rack of antlers. Glenn applied the brakes, but all that did was slow their descent slightly. They continued sliding slowly down the hill, coming closer and closer to the moose. Glenn sounded the horn, but the moose appeared unimpressed by either the sound of the horn or the slowly approaching vehicle. They bumped gently into the moose, just hard enough to cause him to lose his balance. He toppled sideways onto the hood of the car, and in recovering his balance, put his left hind leg down through the windshield on the passenger side, with his hoof down on the floor of the car between the passenger's legs. Nobody moved. It was like a stop-action movie, with the occupants of the car staring out through the windshield and the moose staring straight ahead into the forest. The moose moved first, starting with his magnificent head. He turned to look at them, and his expression was one of utter disdain. He clearly thought it was time to end this relationship, so he hoisted his leg out of the car and ambled off into the forest, leaving the others to deal with the broken windshield and their shattered nerves. Note, The 4-H movement began in the 19th century in various parts of rural USA, with more formal clubs being formed in the late 1800s. It began as a program for rural youth, but is now both rural and urban. The 4 H's stand for Head, Heart, Health, and Hands. The 4-H movement is learned to do by doing. Gasoline leak. Here's another story Glenn has told me about driving on Saskatchewan roads at that time. He was heading back to Saskatoon from a trip to northeast Saskatchewan and stopped for fuel at a garage at a country crossroads. He had been driving mainly on gravel roads, and the attendant noticed that there was a leak in the tank. He said they could fix it. They put his car up on the hoist and removed the tank. They started up a small gasoline motor, hooked its exhaust pipe to the intake of the gas tank, and let it run like that for 30 minutes or so. Then they rolled their welding cart next to the tank and fired up the torch. It was at this point that Glenn developed a keen interest in the barley crop across the road and moved quickly to have a closer look. The garage guys brazed the hole in the tank, turned off the torch, put the tank back into the car, and sent Glenn on his way. Why didn't everyone get blown up, you ask? It seems that the exhaust from the little motor replaced the air in the tank with a mixture of mainly carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, both of which are non-flammable, thus preventing the gasoline from catching fire and exploding. The garage guys said they do these repairs all the time. Driveway not shoveled. Carol and I were married in 1958 and lived happily in Winnipeg until 1964, when Prudential Insurance transferred me to Saskatoon to begin farm mortgage loaning in Saskatchewan. I found a split-level home on a suburban street for Carol and our family of 3. Kevin was 4, David was 3, and Jill was 7 months. The story takes place at a time when homeowners were still using shovels to clear their driveways. Home snowblowers were not yet common. Most people in Saskatoon took the conventional approach to clearing their driveways. They shoveled and piled the cleared snow on both sides of the driveway. As the winter wore on, with repeated shoveling of the driveway, the piles on each side got higher and higher. No problem, right? Not exactly. Not when the famous Saskatchewan winds are taken into account. A calm day in Saskatchewan is so unusual that people remark on it. People remark on a windy day too, not because it's unusual, but because they complain about it. People with driveways cleared in the conventional way complained even louder about the wind when they watched it bring snow from miles around and dump it in their freshly cleared driveway. Sometimes it would bring enough snow to fill the driveway until it was level with the banks on each side. That led to an even bigger shoveling job, resulting in even higher banks along each side of the driveway. If you are beginning to detect a vicious circle here, you're getting the picture. As the weeks went by, the shoveling job got harder and harder. The wind was having fun. The owners of the various driveways weren't. During the winter of 1964, soon after we moved into our Quance Avenue house in Saskatoon, I decided to take a different approach to dealing with the snow on the driveway. I did almost no shoveling. I simply used the car to pack the snow in place. With each snowfall, I would drive back and forth over the full width of the driveway, packing the latest snowfall on top of the old packed snow. The result was that the driveway rose higher and higher, ending up as high or higher than the snow on the lawn. This meant that the wind would carry its load of snow right over our driveway and make it available to our neighbors to fill in their driveways. I felt it was the least we could do. This approach worked well except for a day or two in the spring, when the structural integrity of the ice crystals supporting the built-up driveway began to break down with increasing heat from the sun. That made the driveway temporarily impassable. We had to park our car on the street during that period, a small price to pay for not having to do any shoveling all winter. The driving lesson. My family and I were having a nice breakfast one quiet Saturday morning in Saskatoon when, glancing out of our front window, we noticed some activity at our neighbor's house across the street. This was a quiet English couple who had immigrated to Canada some years before and who were happiest when no one took any notice of them. The husband worked for the Saskatchewan government and had a government car. They also kept a car for personal use and, being English, had recently acquired an Anglia, an English make-up car now extinct and a rarity in Saskatoon at the time. Anglias were low-powered, angular, slab-sided cars that were quite unsuited to Saskatchewan conditions, but they were easy on fuel and okay for fetching groceries or taking the kids to their music lessons, etc. The government full-size Ford always sat outside on their driveway, while the Anglia was kept in the garage. The Ford, when plugged in, would start well on the coldest Saskatoon winter days. The Anglia, when kept in the garage and plugged in, would also start quite well on the coldest Saskatoon winter days, but it needed the protection of the garage to do so. The problem was that the wife didn't have a driver's license, which rather limited the Anglia's utility when the husband was away in the government car. The plan, it appeared, was for the wife to learn to drive, and this quiet Saturday morning was an ideal time to continue with the lessons. I must emphasize that these neighbors were very quiet people. Flamboyant would definitely not be the word to describe them. They did not like to be the center of attention. The thing that was about to happen would have been embarrassing for anyone, but it would be excruciatingly embarrassing for them. First, the husband backed the government Ford out of the driveway and parked it by the curb in front of their house. He then backed the Anglia out of the garage and parked it in the driveway. His wife came out of the house and got into the driver's seat of the Anglia. He got into the passenger's side. The driving lesson was about to begin. She started the car and began backing slowly down the driveway. Things were going fine until, concentrating hard on her steering, she inadvertently pressed the accelerator to the floor. Everything happened very quickly after that. Even an underpowered Anglia can move quickly in certain situations, and this was one of them. The Anglia roared backwards, did a screeching backwards turn in the street, and slammed rear end first into the side of the government Ford. There arose a cloud of dust and the sound of various bits of metal and glass tinkling down onto the pavement. The Saturday morning quiet then returned, except for the sound of a lone hubcap rolling down the street. Rolling, 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 jing, 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 jitter, 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 clatter, 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 clink, as it settled onto the pavement half a block away. Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Finally, the husband got out of the passenger side of the Anglia and, shoulders hunched and head down, stalked up the driveway into the house. A few seconds later, the wife got out of the driver's side of the Anglia and, shoulders hunched and head down, skittered up the driveway into the house. Thus endeth the driving lesson for that day. Absent-minded professors. One winter day in downtown Saskatoon, a University of Saskatchewan professor with a reputation for absent-mindedness found a way to add to his reputation. He was in his car waiting for a traffic light to change when he noticed a young mother with a toddler and a baby in a stroller struggling to get onto a bus. The prof got out of his car and helped the young mother board the bus. Then he looked up, noticed the bus number, and realized this was the bus that went by his house. He thought, well, I might as well get on and go home too. Which he did, leaving his car with the driver's door wide open, idling at the light. The police eventually brought it home to him. Another U of Saskatchewan prof, who had a reputation for not traveling light, packed his 3 steamer trunks, including his entire collection of marching music, long-playing records, flew to England and presented himself at the university where he was to spend a sabbatical year. The faculty members present raised their eyebrows slightly and asked, aren't you supposed to be starting your sabbatical next semester? He then had to make a hasty, nervous phone call back to Saskatoon to make sure his position at the U of S could be made available to him for another semester, after which he and his 3 steamer trunks and his entire collection of marching music records flew back to Saskatoon with the intention of repeating the whole excursion a few months later. I am indebted to a friend for telling me the next 2 stories. A professor and his wife were having guests for dinner one evening. His wife suggested that he go upstairs and put on a tie and a better shirt. Later, as guests were beginning to arrive, she wondered what was taking her husband so long to change his shirt, put on a tie, and come back down to assume his hosting duties. She went upstairs where she found him fast asleep in bed. Apparently, as he began taking off his shirt, he slipped naturally into the routine of changing into his pajamas and going to bed, forgetting all about the guests and even the need to have dinner. Then there was the pipe-smoking professor at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, who had set off from his chambers to walk to one of his classes. he often had to stop to relight his pipe as he walked along. If the wind was blowing and was at his back, all would be fine. But if the wind was in his face, all would not be fine. When lighting his pipe, he would have to turn his back to the wind to protect the flame. If, after lighting his pipe, he found himself facing towards his class, he would continue walking in that direction, and the students would have the benefit of his wisdom for that day. However, if after lighting his pipe, he found himself facing back towards his chambers, he would then walk in that direction, completely forgetting that there was a classroom full of students awaiting him. Budget meetings. My 10 years, 1968 to 77, working at the University of Saskatchewan were instructive. There's no denying that university people are generally very intelligent. There's also no denying that they have the same personality problems as the rest of the population. However, when you combine the two, you can get some spectacular results. For example, when you combine a superior intellect with a nitpicking personality, the result can be a nitpicker of monumental proportions. Similarly, combine high intelligence with a penchant for pettiness, and you will have pettiness beyond your worst nightmare. Or combine a bipolar disorder with superior intellect, and chaos won't be far behind. But combine high intelligence with a great sense of humor, and watch the fun begin. One year, Red Fraser, at that time the colorful dean of the Western College of Veterinary Medicine, WCVM, was a member of the University Budget Committee. These were the sort of sessions that only an accountant could love. Dean Fraser was a bright, high-energy, action-oriented guy in a slow-moving committee, so something was bound to happen. The committee was sitting through a series of presentations by various deans defending their budgets. No one was more bored than the dean of WCVM, who kept looking for ways to make the sessions more interesting. It was time for presentation of the budget for the College of Dentistry, and the dean of the college was presenting. After his remarks, the committee chair asked for questions and comments. The dean of WCVM had a comment. He said, "At the WCVM we deal with all animals, everything from reptiles to birds to mammals, from pets to farm animals, with all parts of the animals and all their diseases. Now, here we have a college that deals with only one animal, and then only with its mouth. I don't see how a budget increase can be justified. In fact, I don't see why they need much of a budget at all." It took some time for the dean of the College of Dentistry to stop spluttering, recover his composure, and realize his leg was being pulled. On another occasion, the dean of home economics, a refined and gentle lady, was defending her college's budget. This wasn't, to be blunt, a very important session. The College of Home Economics was relatively small, and the rumor was that the college was to be phased out before long. Still, when the opportunity to ask questions came, the committee wanted to appear interested. So someone noted that a male faculty member, Dr. Art Sumner, had recently joined what had always been an all-female faculty. The questioner wanted to know how the new faculty member was getting along. "Oh, quite nicely, thank you," answered the dignified, gentle dean of home economics. "He's feeling his way slowly." At which point the dean of WCVM choked on a cookie, had a coughing fit, and had to be patted on the back. I realize that this story can be seen in some ways as sexist, but I would argue that the story is not out of line considering the personalities involved. The dean of home ec at that time did indeed give the impression of someone who lived above the rough and tumble of the world, and who wouldn't know a double entendre if she tripped over it. The dean of vet med, on the other hand, ran a very tight ship in his big and important college, and was always up to his elbows, pardon the expression, in everything that was going on. No way a double entendre would get by him. Frozen feet. My work at the Extension Division of the University of Saskatchewan involved organizing short courses on various agricultural subjects. Invariably, the behind-the-scenes work was more complicated than it appeared. We had a shortage of farriers in Saskatchewan in those days, while at the same time we had people who wanted to be trained as farriers. A farrier is someone who shoes horses. I recently read a book that said in England, in recent centuries, farriers also did minor veterinary work on horses. Shoeing horses was only one of their skills. My job was to find an instructor, schedule a time for a 5-day course, do the publicity, and make all the arrangements. These included getting a supply of horses' feet for the trainers to practice on, because, as the instructor said, no way these trainees are going to touch the feet of a live horse until they know what they're doing. This led me to arrange for a supply of horses' feet to be shipped by flatbed truck to Saskatoon from the closest source, the packing plant in Edmonton. Fortunately, it was the dead of winter, so there was no concern about the feet thawing and rotting during the trip. They were frozen solid all the way. Actually, they were more than feet. They were horses' legs from the knee down, including feet. That way, the farriers in training could lash the knee bones to a stall fence in the barn where the course was being taught, turn and let the hooves poke out between their knees as they learned the farrier's craft. I realize, dear reader, that these memoirs may at times not have you quivering with suspense. But in how many other books of memoirs would you encounter a story about shipping dead horses' feet? You can't have everything. Prairie winters. Weather was reported in imperial measurements when I grew up, so it's natural for me to talk about Fahrenheit temperatures and wind blowing in miles per hour, mph, when telling stories of my childhood. Then in 1971, when Canada switched to reporting weather in metric measurements, I willingly switched to the metric system and began talking about temperatures in Celsius and wind in kilometers per hour, kmh. The problem for Canada was that the U.S. resisted, and is still resisting, the change to metric. The U.S. is such an important trading partner for Canada that we could not follow the rest of the world in conversion to metric. We were forced to live with a blend of metric and imperial measurements. Thanks to the school system in Ontario, younger people have had no exposure to the imperial system, so will not be able to relate very well to my reporting on temperatures in Fahrenheit or wind in miles per hour. Today, of course, they can quickly pull out their smartphones to find the equivalent measurement in the imperial system. Winters are cold on the prairies. I call Winnipeg my hometown, and legend has it that the corner of Portage and Main is the coldest street corner in the world in winter months. So when we moved from Winnipeg to Saskatoon in 1964, we didn't think Saskatchewan would have anything to show us Manitobans about winter. Then on about the 2nd of January, in our new Saskatoon home, the cold settled in. For 6 weeks, the warmest it got during the day was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with lows of minus 35 to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit every night. This continued for 6 weeks, often with a wind blowing. Even we Manitobans were impressed. We had a Trinidadian high school student staying with us that winter, his first winter in Canada. As fall arrived and the weather began to get cooler, he couldn't believe how cold it was. We thought it was just nice, typical fall weather. He had never experienced anything like it. But when January came along, the short winter days and the extreme cold were beyond his worst nightmares. We tried to tell him to protect his ears in such weather, and even bought him a pair of earmuffs. You really don't want to freeze your ears, we said. He didn't like having anything on his head. He hated the earmuffs and usually kept them in his pocket. He couldn't stand wearing a hat either. The earmuffs were in his pocket one day as he waited for the bus to school at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind blowing. He came home with frozen ears. He thought when your ears froze they would just thaw out again. He learned otherwise as he endured the pain, the swelling, the blistering, the oozing, and having to stay home for a week. He began wearing the earmuffs. Then one day, when the temperature warmed up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, he found it so warm that he insisted on walking home from school instead of taking the bus, and came into the house talking about what a warm day it was. He was made of pretty stern stuff, this lad. He eventually married a Canadian girl, and they settled down north of Edmonton.